I don't know what to do with this thing for this book review. That'll do. Hello everyone, welcome back to A Fictional Escapist. Today's video is the Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson book review. It has taken me a couple of weeks to put into words exactly how I feel about this book, but as you can see by a little friend here, I lie straight in the middle. If I had to give this a star rating, I would be sitting at a 2.5, just dead center, and things didn't work for me, but it wasn't necessarily a bad book. How I'm going to structure this review is some overall sort of, I guess, plot stuff without spoilers, and then go into our characters and what their powers are. So that is going to be slight spoilers for people who don't want to know anything going into this book, so we'll put that in the timestamp below, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what didn't work for me and why it didn't work for me. Now, I found it very hard to put into words why Illborn didn't work for me and to get my thoughts and feelings out about Illborn. The concept itself was cool, but it's nothing new. So basically every part of this book has been pulled from somewhere else. It doesn't feel original. Like there was no part in this book that I thought, oh, that's cool, that's a different concept. It's, oh, here's the influence, this is where it's come from. Now that is not necessarily a bad thing at all. A lot of writers are told not to reinvent the wheel, particularly in a debut novel. You read what you like for a reason. So if you want to write that sort of story, go for it, make it your own. And I think that advice has been taken very literally with this book. But that being said, it's going to have a comforting feel to people who like these sort of stories. Now, it has been likened to The Wheel of Time. That is a series that I have not read personally, so I can't comment, but it does feel like that sort of concept, where we have a group of young people, they've come into some kind of power, and they're being hunted by the higher-ups or some sort of authority figure, because they're threatened by what it means for their way of living to have these powers out in the world. So we are following four main characters. They're all from different backgrounds, they all come from different circumstances, and they each have their own set of abilities that are somehow connected. Once they hit adulthood, so I'm talking sort of 18, 20, they start to have the same vision, causing them nightmares, and they're all seeing the other four figures and a gate of some sort. And I just want to tell you now, get used to that vision, because you are going to read it a lot. By the end of this book, you are going to be able to recite that vision to people in your life. Moving on, we'll save that for my thoughts. This book has a feel of classic fantasy that could be built up to an epic as the stakes get higher. The writing is very easy to digest. I think that people who are new to fantasy could pick this book up easily and just fly through it. I think sort of for fans of Mistborn, I think this book would be a good time for people who like that earlier style of Sanderson writing. This is a super character-driven book. I think part of the reason that I personally struggled is because I'm not a character-driven reader, and plot and world building and everything else comes secondary to the development of these characters. We sit with these four POVs, each chapter being a different person's POV for 700 pages essentially, and the plot line that's sort of overarching and trying to come into the scope of things, which is, there's political and military and religious entities that are threatened by the powers that these four people possess, and they're trying to hunt them down as heretics because they don't want them to be out in the world, is very much secondary to our characters' development and our characters' lives over the 2-year span that we're in this book for. I think when this plot point do come together, it's of convenience. It's just to basically go, oh, here's a bit of a plot, let's keep moving along with these characters, rather than, having it cleverly interwoven into all four characters' storylines and having that be a connection that we have for each of these characters and pushing us along. It's just remember this, that's here, let's keep going. I'm going to jump into the characters now, so I'll put a timestamp for spoilers down below. I don't think anything here is super spoilery. Just if you don't want to know anything going into it, then maybe skip this next little bit. So we have four characters that we are following. The first and my favourite of the four was Corin. He's the runt of the family, teased, deemed weak, and a little more sensitive than the other boys. He questions why things need to be run a certain way and ideally would like to live in a world of peace, where opposing clans didn't feel the need to fight each other and kill each other all the time. Because of these views, he's looked down upon and he's exiled from the clan that he's living in, and he takes his friend Agbeth with him, and they sort of go away and they live in exile for a little while. During the exile, he comes into his powers, which is almost like a mind manipulation of beast and man, which is honestly the most interesting power that we have in this book. But I can't say too much more without getting into spoiler territory. This was a storyline that I honestly found myself caring about the most. It was the underdog character. The friend that he takes with him is also part of that underdog character storyline, and I cared about them. It's almost like a coming of age. Corin's very sweet, very naive, and very loyal to the woman that he loves and will protect her above all else. We also have a nice little bit of disability representation in the love interest of this character. Next up, we have Alana. She is the daughter of a dying courtesan on the run from the church and local authority. Alana needs to escape fast. She uses her power of manipulating lust and controlling men to secure her safety, putting her survival above all else. I started out really liking Alana. She was ballsy and she was willing to do anything to survive, and unfortunately she quickly became the chapter that I hated reading because she became whiny, and the way that she used her magic was the same every single time. The magic and the repetition of the scenes that she had. Every male portrayed in this book thought that Alana was God's gift to the cis male groin area, and unless they were ugly, she was into it. She was like, yep, would sit on that, can use that, bank that for later. But if you were ugly, you're probably going to end up like, she don't want you. I mean, she might use it for a bit, but she don't want you. Next up, we have Arian, which is a similar name to Corin, don't get those two mixed up, and he is a member of royalty who wants to be a military leader and excels in all physical tasks. His ability lies in warfare and battle, pulling energy and becoming the best warrior he can be, which has devastating effects for anyone in his wake. Arian is the smartest of the four characters that we follow in our troop, in my opinion. His decisions make sense, even if you don't agree with them. They at least are logical and they make sense, and he uses these visions that he's having wisely and is actively trying to put the pieces together. So I didn't really care for Arian at the beginning of the book, and sort of opposite to Alana, I started caring more once the pieces started coming together and he was at the center of putting them in place. Lastly, we have Lyanna. She is a devout priestess who is ordained under the Holy Order and is unwavering in her faith. Now that can get annoying to some people if you don't like religion and just devotion to faith in your books. I would probably stick this one out because Lyanna is very, very devout. She quickly takes to healing, which is where her abilities lie. Lyanna is a really lovely character. I feel those religious things don't really bother me. I grew up surrounded by Catholicism, which is where a lot of fantasy draws their religious aspects from, but I struggled with her chapters because she was so nice and it was so repetitious. The repetition for this character in particular was next level. She prayed a lot in nearly every chapter. I would say every chapter, and sometimes more than once, and those prayers would follow a particular sentence structure, and it would just be every time the same thing. You'd be reading the same thing essentially. Those are the characters. That's the book essentially. I heard Nico from Nico's book review describe this as basically we're reading four character stories and they all follow a very similar route. It's very formulaic for each of the four characters. So if you're someone like me who struggles with repetition, you're going to get very frustrated by this book, and I think that's where I sit, is quite frustrated. But those are the characters, so where are my thoughts on the book and the story overall? Illborn was a little bit tropey. It had a selection of chosen ones who don't really know or understand why they're chosen. We see them develop and come into their powers, as well as be hunted over the duration of this book. Each character themselves fit very neatly into a trope or subcategory of fantasy, so it does feel safe. That's, again, not necessarily a bad thing in my opinion, particularly if you want that comforting fantasy feel. A couple of issues that I have with the book is just the insane amount of repetition that this book had, be it the vision, which was repeated over and over again. The structure of the book was repetitive. The dialogue, which I'll get into a little bit later, was repetitive in terms of its structure. It all felt very formulaic. So watching Nico's review from Nico's Book Reviews channel linked below, he said that it felt like we were watching origin stories, but all those origins stories felt similar, and I really couldn't have said it better myself. I will link both his channel and his review down below because he articulates a little bit better than I can. Speaking of dialogue, the dialogue in this book felt formal and structured. A lot of the time the characters lacked personality when they were speaking, in my opinion, which is honestly a trap that a lot of new authors can fall into. They're like, I have to be writing proper English, but they don't really give their characters room to move, and they don't develop their personality through the dialogue, which is a shame. There was also some phrasing that didn't fit the tone of the book. There were some times when modern jargon was sort of thrown into a sentence when that sentence didn't call for it and took me out of the story. But for the most part, the dialogue was repetitious and it got boring. For a character-driven book, it's so important to distinguish our four characters from one another, and a big way that you can do that is dialogue. How do they speak? Are they speaking differently because of where they come from or how they've been brought up? And it just wasn't done here, unfortunately. The next thing that annoyed me was the magic system felt super easy. Not to read necessarily, but for the characters. Once the characters had figured out that they had a power, they could just use it and go ham, and it worked every time. We had a bit of a consequence in Alana's arc, and we also had a hint of a limitation in Corin's arc, but they were so minute that if you were just reading it and flipping through the pages, you wouldn't necessarily remember that those were limitations or consequences, and you'd move on. It just seemed to work every time, and once they'd figured it out, they were like, let's go, let's just use it, let's roll, let's get on with it. The last issue that I had with Illborn was pace. While this reads very quickly when you are in the world, the repetition really slowed it down for me and made me not want to pick it up. I got to the last couple of hundred pages and I was actively resisting picking Illborn up. I didn't want to go back to it because I knew that the same words and the same phrasings were going to be presented to me over and over again, and I still had 200 pages to go. That being said, once I was reading it and I was back into the flow of things, I enjoyed it to an extent. I will admit I did skim over parts that felt overly repetitious or had been explained to death. I also think that this suffered from over-explanation and as well as the repetition. For example, if we had two characters going through the same thing in the same time period, it was likely that something from the previous chapter would then be repeated again, and for whoever we were following at that particular time, which again drew me out of the story and just made me not want to pick it up. All of that being said, yes, I had a large number of issues with Illborn, but I don't think this is a bad book. I think this is very approachable, and yes, it could use some tweaking. It could probably have been 200 pages shorter, but I did like the overarching themes that we had of religion and political military control, and the conversations about what is right, what is wrong in the face of these two elements. And that is something that I love in my fantasy, so having those religious and political elements did help me get through the end of this book. I just wish that aspect was more drawn out as opposed to some of the repetition that we got amongst the characters. But something I will say was this is probably one of the best prologues that I've ever read. It hooked me. Within 17 pages I had a oh shite moment, and I love when authors can do that. And the epilogue ties to the prologue, another thing that I love. So even though the prologue isn't necessarily, part of the main story, having that tie in at the end to show us what we're getting into in the larger sense of the series excites me. I like this book enough to pick up book 2. I'm very interested to see what Mr. Jackson does with the criticism and with the feedback that he's gotten off Illborn, to see where that goes in book 2. Those are my thoughts on Illborn. Maybe you think I'm being a little bit too harsh, remembering that reading is subjective. If you've read it, let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you like the video, give it one of these. If you want to see more of it, then click subscribe at your will, and I will catch you in the next one. Ciao.